The plumber called me while I was sitting in the second pew of St. Gilles Church in Bruges, waiting for the 11 o'clock Mass to begin. His name was Peter Davos, and he had been fixing things in my house for 19 years, and he was not a man who called without reason. I felt the phone vibrate in my breast pocket, saw his name on the screen, and slipped out through the side door into the cold November air before the organ had finished its opening phrase. He said, "Hendrik, come home. Come now. Do not tell your son. Come alone." His voice had a quality I had not heard in 19 years of knowing him. Not excitement, not alarm in the ordinary sense. Something quieter and more fundamental than alarm. The voice of a man who has seen something he cannot unsee and is trying to determine the correct response. I asked him what had happened. He said, "Just come. I will show you." I drove back through the quiet Sunday morning streets of Bruges, the canal water gray and still in the November light, the tourists not yet out in the numbers that would fill the bridges by afternoon. I parked on the Prédicaren, 2 houses down from my own, and walked. I let myself in through the side gate rather than the front door. I do not know exactly why I did this. Some instinct from my professional life. Perhaps the instinct of a man who spent 38 years determining how information moved and who had access to it and why. An instinct toward the value of being unannounced. Peter was standing in the hallway outside Marta's room. His face confirmed everything his voice had promised. Marta's room. She had called it her study in the last years of her life. The ground floor room at the back of the house that had originally been intended as a guest room, and that she had slowly claimed for her own, bringing in the particular things she needed around her as her health declined, and the stairs became more of an obstacle than a pleasure. Her books, her correspondence desk. The armchair by the window where she read in the afternoon. The old Delft tiles she had found at a market in Amsterdam that lined the fireplace surround. She had died in that room 14 months ago, and I had not found the capacity to clear it or change it or use it for anything other than what it had been when she was in it. I had hired Peter to investigate a water stain on the baseboard that I had noticed spreading over the winter months. The stain was real. The cause was not what either of us had expected. He took me in. He pointed to the wall beside the fireplace, the shared wall between Marta's room and the larger room that my son Luke and his wife Sophie now occupied. There was a section of the paneling old painted pine, the original 19th century paneling that was one of the reasons we had bought the house, that had been pulled away from the wall at the base and replaced not quite correctly. You would not notice it unless you were looking for something wrong. Peter had been looking for something wrong. The water stain was a separate problem, a minor issue with a window seal, nothing structural. But in the process of checking the baseboard, he had found the paneling loose, and when he pressed it, it moved in a way that paneling sealed to a wall for 100 years should not move. He had looked more carefully. He had found the edge of a cut made with a fine blade, running along 3 sides of a section approximately 40 centimeters square at the base of the wall. Someone had opened the cavity behind the paneling and resealed it not perfectly. He shone his work light through the gap. Inside, resting on the original lime plaster of the cavity wall, was a fireproof document box. Green metal old model, the kind you could buy at any office supply shop in the 1990s. Approximately 30 centimeters by 20 by 15. There was a combination lock on the front. I have spent 38 years as a forensic accountant in the Netherlands and Belgium. I began my career with the Dutch Tax Authority in 1981 and spent 14 years there before being seconded to a joint investigative unit that handled complex cross-border financial fraud in the Benelux region. I retired in 2019 from a position as senior partner in a forensic accounting firm in Antwerp that handled private investigations, litigation support, and asset tracing for law firms, financial institutions, and occasionally government agencies. I have opened many boxes in my professional life, literal and figurative. I have found money hidden in false walls, documents buried in garden beds, account records coded into household ledgers, evidence of fraud in places that required the specific imaginative capacity to think like the person who had hidden it. The person who had hidden this box was my wife. My name is Hendrik Claus. I am 69 years old. I was born in Ghent, grew up in a house above my father's bookshop, studied accountancy at the University of Leuven, and spent 38 years becoming one of the more effective forensic investigators in the Benelux region, which is a distinction that requires the capacity to see the structure of a financial lie with the same precision that an engineer sees the fault in a bridge. I am not describing myself as extraordinary. I am describing myself as a specific kind of person, a person for whom the detection of concealment is the primary professional skill, and for whom, therefore, the discovery that my own wife had concealed something in the wall of her own room was a particular and profound kind of shock. I want to tell you something about forensic accounting because it matters to this story, and because people who have not done it tend to have an inaccurate picture of what it is. Forensic accounting is not primarily mathematics. The mathematics is straightforward, and anyone with basic training can perform it. What forensic accounting requires is the capacity to imagine concealment, to look at a financial record and ask not only what it says, but what it would look like if certain things were hidden, and how a person who wanted to hide them would use the available instruments to do so. It requires a specific quality of negative imagination, the ability to see the shape of a thing by looking at the space where it is not. I developed this capacity over many years, and it became eventually a quality of general perception that I applied to things outside financial records. I could read the structure of a conversation the same way I read a balance sheet, looking for the discrepancy between what was stated and what the full picture would require if the stated thing were true. I had applied this capacity professionally to corporate fraudsters, to politicians with hidden assets, to family members defrauding elderly relatives through manipulated estate documents. I had spent 38 years looking at the worst that financial selfishness can produce in human behavior, and I had developed through this exposure a specific and non-sentimental understanding of how motivated people behave when they believe the benefit of concealment exceeds the risk of discovery. I had never applied this capacity to my own family. I had not needed to, and I had not wanted to, and I now understood, chosen not to notice certain things that my professional training should have flagged. I had chosen for the specific human reasons that professional training cannot entirely override, to maintain a version of my son that did not require the application of forensic perception. That choice, as choices of deliberate non-perception tend to do, had cost something. Marta and I had been married for 41 years. She was from a farming family in Zeeland, the Dutch coastal province, and she had come to Leuven to study art history at the age of 18 and had never gone back to Zeeland except for visits. She was quiet in the way of people who have learned to be precise about when they speak and therefore make their words count. She was honest with the specific matter-of-fact quality of people from that part of the Netherlands, a regional directness that some people find abrupt, and that I had always found deeply restful. She had been ill for the last 4 years of her life, with a degenerative condition that affected her mobility and eventually her speech. And she had managed this decline with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, making the practical adjustments one at a time as they became necessary without drama and without complaint, and dying finally in the armchair by the window on a morning in October the previous year. I want to tell you something about Marta because she is the center of this story, even though she is not present in the part of it I am about to describe. She was a more precise thinker than I gave her credit for in the ordinary current of our life together. And I say this not as criticism of myself, but as an honest acknowledgement that when you live with someone for 41 years, you develop a domestic understanding of them that is accurate in aggregate, but that misses specific qualities, because specific qualities are invisible in the continuous context of ordinary life. You see the person through the accumulated pattern of your shared experience, and the pattern is real, but it is not the whole picture. What I understood about Marta from 41 years of marriage, that she was patient, that she was loyal to the people she had committed to in a way that did not require renewal or reconsidering, that she had a quality of precise observation about the natural and material world that produced in her an extensive and exact vocabulary for things most people described vaguely or not at all. She knew the names of things. She knew the specific properties of different papers and different textiles and different stones. She had been trained in art history, and this training had given her a systematic methodology for looking at objects that she applied to everything she looked at. What I did not fully appreciate until I read her letter and listened to her recordings was that this methodology for looking at objects also applied to situations, to patterns of behavior, to the structural analysis of what people were doing versus what they were saying. She had been applying the art historian's eye, which is the eye of someone who has learned to distinguish authentic from inauthentic, original from reproduction, the genuine article from the skilled forgery to the behavior of the people in her house for the last 2 years of her life. And she had been documenting what she saw. She was better at this than she knew she was. I have said this to Annalore, who agreed. She said your wife was a natural forensic observer. She said some people are. They see the gap between the stated and the actual without being trained to see it. They find the inconsistency in the pattern without knowing that finding inconsistencies in patterns has a professional name. I said she was also dying. She said yes. She was doing this while dying. She held this for a moment. She said, I find that rather extraordinary. I do too. I had not known about the box. I had lived in the house with her for 41 years, and I had not known. And that not knowing had a specific quality as I knelt on the floor of her room with Peter's light in my hand, looking at the green metal container through the gap in the 19th century paneling. It had the quality of the moment in a complex financial investigation when you find the account that explains all the anomalies you have been noting for months. The specific feeling of comprehension arriving in a form you did not expect. I knew the combination. Marta used the same 4-digit combination for everything she thought was important the year we were married, 1978. She had told me this once early in our marriage with the specific casual honesty of someone who was not planning to hide anything from me. And she had used it for years for the small lockbox we kept in the bedroom for passports and important documents, the combination I had known for 4 decades. She had used it here. I did not open the box in the room. Not yet. I was thinking about Luke, my son, 36 years old, my son and his wife Sophie, who had moved into the house with me 11 months after Marta's death, in the room across the hall from Marta's study, under the stated reason of looking after me in my grief. And I was thinking about the cut in the paneling, the cut that had been made with a fine blade from the outside, from the hallway side of the paneling, meaning the cavity had been accessed from outside the room, meaning someone had opened the wall and reached in, meaning the paneling had been resealed imperfectly. Someone had been in the cavity. The box was still there in the back corner, not where someone reaching through a small opening from outside would find it easily. But someone had been looking. I looked at Peter. He read my expression. He said the cut was made recently. The paint on the cut edges is still slightly soft. I took the box, wrapped it in a cloth from my coat pocket, and left the room. I closed the door. I told Peter to replace the loose section of baseboard and leave the rest as it was. I told him to go out through the back garden and park his van on the street around the corner and wait for my call. He asked no questions. He was that kind of man. He had known me for 19 years, and he had a quality of professional discretion that I had always valued. I went to my own study on the upper floor. I closed and locked the door. I sat at my desk and I held the box for a moment before opening it. The combination turned on the first attempt. Inside, resting on a piece of green felt, was a USB drive, a small notebook with a pale blue cover that I recognized as one of the notebooks Marta had used for her correspondence in her last years, and a sealed envelope with my name on it in her handwriting. The handwriting was labored the specific handwriting of someone whose hands were no longer fully reliable, but it was unmistakably hers. I opened the envelope first. The letter was dated 4 months before her death. It was 2 pages in her handwriting with occasional words crossed out and rewritten where her hand had slipped, and it said the following. Hendrik, if you are reading this, then you have found the box without my being able to tell you about it, which means things went the way I was afraid they might go. I want to tell you first that I am sorry for hiding this from you. I am sorry for the manner of it. I wanted to protect you, and I am not certain I chose the right way to do that. But by the time I understood fully what was happening, I was not well enough to manage it differently. What I need to tell you is about Luke and Sophie. 6 months ago, Sophie came to me while you were traveling for work. She was very calm and very kind in the manner she has when she wants something. She told me she wanted to discuss the house. She told me that she and Luke were concerned about the long-term management of the property and the estate, and that they thought it would be sensible given my health to begin a conversation about transferring ownership of the house to their names, now rather than through probate. She said this was for tax efficiency. She said it would protect me because it would simplify things for everyone after I was gone. She showed me a document. She said it was a simple transfer agreement. She asked me to sign it. I did not sign it. I told her I would discuss it with you. She said she thought it would be better handled between the two of us, woman to woman, without troubling you while you were busy with work. I told her again that I would discuss it with you. She left the room. She was not angry when she left. That was the part that frightened me. She was not angry. She was recalibrating. 2 weeks later, Luke came to me. He said the same thing Sophie had said in different words in the manner of a script divided between two people. He said it would be simpler and more loving for everyone. He asked me to sign the document again. When I asked him to show me the document, I noticed it was slightly different from the one Sophie had shown me. There was an additional clause I did not remember seeing before. I am not a lawyer. I told him I wanted to have someone review it. He became upset, not loudly, quietly upset, which with Luke has always been more serious than loud. He said he was hurt that I would not trust the people who were looking after me. He left. I have been a fair witness to my own children all my life. I have tried not to see what I wanted to see. After those 2 conversations, I paid very close attention to things I had perhaps not been paying sufficient attention to before. I found several things. I have documented them as well as I am able to on the USB drive. There are also recordings. My phone has a function I did not know about until my friend Els showed me which records conversations automatically when you activate it. I activated it for every conversation with Luke and Sophie after the second request to sign the document. Everything is on the USB drive. There are also scans of documents that I photographed with my phone when Luke left papers in the kitchen one afternoon, and I had approximately 15 minutes before he came back. I am telling you all of this because I know you will know what to do with it. You have spent your entire life knowing what to do with this kind of information. I am sorry that the information is about our son. I am sorry that I was not able to tell you differently. I love you and I trust you completely, and that trust is why I am putting this in your hands. I held the letter for a long time after I finished reading it. The November light through my study window was the flat gray light of a Belgian November morning, the light that has no shadow and no direction that illuminates everything equally and harshly. I sat in it and I held my wife's letter and I allowed myself approximately 10 minutes of something that I could not have named precisely but that occupied the space between grief and rage, and the specific cold clarity that I recognized from the beginning of every significant investigation I had ever conducted. Then I put the letter down and opened the laptop and plugged in the USB drive. There was a folder. Inside the folder were 3 subfolders. The first was labeled Documents, the second Recordings, the third Notes. I opened Documents first, because that is where I would have started in any professional context, and I had no reason to deviate from professional methodology. There were 9 photographs taken with a phone camera of what appeared to be printed pages. The quality was imperfect but readable. 4 of the photographs showed what appeared to be a transfer agreement for the property. The house in Bruges. It was in 2 versions, presumably the original shown by Sophie and the modified version shown by Luke. I examined both carefully. The modification was subtle. A clause in the second version specified that the transfer was unconditional, removing language in the first version that had included a provision for Marta's continued right of occupation. It was the kind of modification that a non-specialist might not notice on a second reading of a long document, particularly a person in poor health who was being asked to make a decision under emotional pressure. The remaining 5 photographs were of pages that appeared to be from a bank account statement. I recognized the format as a Belgian private bank. The account number was partially visible. The amounts visible in the photographs ran to several €100,000 in transactions over an approximate 18-month period. I could see columns, but not all the reference fields. Enough to establish the pattern. Not enough yet for the full picture. I opened the recordings folder. There were 11 audio files, each labeled with a date. I put on the small earphones I kept in my desk drawer and listened to the first one. Marta's voice came through the earphones with the particular quality of a recording made on a smartphone in a room slightly distant, slightly ambient. She was speaking with Sophie. I recognized Sophie's voice after a few seconds. The conversation was the one Marta had described in the letter. The first conversation, the calm, kind manner, the document, the request. I listened to the whole thing. Then I listened to the second recording, which was the conversation with Luke. Then the third. In the fourth recording, Sophie had brought someone else into the conversation. I did not recognize the voice immediately. It was a man speaking in accented Dutch, formal and slightly distant, the voice of a professional delivering a prepared statement. He described himself as a legal advisor. He said the transfer document was straightforward and standard, and that the delay was creating unnecessary complications, and that time was genuinely a factor here. He said this in the manner of someone who has been briefed on what to say and is saying it competently without being fully aware of all the facts. I noted his manner. I noted the phrasing. I would need to identify who he was. In the fifth recording, Marta was alone speaking into the phone, recording her own notes. It was the most difficult of the 11 to listen to. Her voice was quieter than in the other recordings, more effortful, the voice of someone for whom speaking had become physical work. She was summarizing what had happened in a conversation she had apparently just had, and was documenting before her memory of the details could become uncertain. She was systematic. She noted the date, and the time, and the participants, and the substance of what had been said, and what she had said in response. She had been in those final months, conducting her own version of the kind of field documentation I had required of my junior investigators for decades. She had been conducting it alone from an armchair in declining health, with no training and no resources except her phone and her own methodical mind. I had to stop for a moment at the end of the fifth recording. Just a moment. By the fifth recording, my professional assessment of the situation was complete in its broad outline. By the eighth, I had the specifics I needed to proceed. By the 11th, which was a recording made 6 weeks before Marta's death, and which I will not describe in detail here because the details are not mine to make public, I understood the full dimensions of what my wife had spent the last months of her life building in the wall of her own room, while the people sleeping across the hall believed she was simply declining. Marta had been a precise and methodical woman. She had documented everything she could reach from a phone with a recording function and a camera. She had done it with the quiet, systematic persistence of someone who understood that evidence was worth more than confrontation, and that she did not have the physical capacity for confrontation, even if confrontation had been her preference. She had built the foundation of something in the only way available to her, from her armchair by the window in the last months of her life, and she had sealed it in a box and hidden it in the wall and trusted that I would find it. I sat at my desk for a long time after finishing the last recording. Then I called Peter and told him he could go home and that I would call him in the next few days and that he should not discuss anything he had seen that morning with anyone at all. He said he understood. He was that kind of man. Then I called my lawyer. Her name was Annalore Bayart, and she had been my professional legal advisor for 16 years, and before that had been a colleague at the Joint Investigative Unit in Antwerp. She was 62 years old, and she was the most practically intelligent person I had known in my professional life, which meant she was very practically intelligent indeed. I said, Annalore, I need to come and see you tomorrow morning. I have a matter that requires immediate attention. She said, how serious? I said, significant. She said, 8 o'clock. I spent the remainder of that Sunday in my study working. I have a methodology for beginning a new investigation that I have used for 38 years, and that does not change because the subject of the investigation is my own family. You establish the facts you have. You identify the facts you need. You determine the sequence in which to acquire them and the instruments by which to do so. You map the structure of the concealment before you begin to dismantle it, because dismantling something before you understand its structure produces chaos rather than resolution, and chaos is evidence lost. The facts I had were the documents Marta had photographed, the recordings, her own written account in the letter, and the cut paneling with its implication of recent access to the cavity. The facts I needed were the complete picture of the bank account visible in the photographs, the legal status of any transfer documents that may have been filed. The full financial picture of Luke and Sophie's affairs over the preceding 2 years, and any connection between their activities and Marta's estate. I also needed to understand the timeline. When had the paneling been cut? Peter had said the paint on the cut edges was still slightly soft. I knew from Luke's question about Peter's visit that he was aware Peter had been in the house that Sunday. If the cut was recent, meaning within the last few weeks, then Luke or Sophie had accessed the cavity after Marta's death, and before that Sunday. The box had been hidden well back in the corner. In a dark cavity, reaching through a small opening, you would feel what was directly in front of you. You would not find something pushed into the far corner unless you had a light source and sufficient time. They had been in a hurry. They had not found it. They did not know whether there was anything to find, or whether they had simply found evidence of access and nothing else. This was my working hypothesis. I needed to hold it lightly and continue gathering. Working hypotheses that are held too firmly become the enemy of evidence. I also had a more immediate problem. If Luke or Sophie had accessed the cavity and found that the box was no longer where they had expected it to be and had failed to find it in their search, they would know or suspect that it had been there and was now somewhere else. I did not know when they had last accessed the cavity. I did not know whether they knew Peter had been in the house that morning. I needed to proceed with the assumption that I had limited time before they understood that the situation had changed. Luke and Sophie were away for the weekend. They had driven to Liège on Saturday to visit Sophie's sister and had said they would return Sunday evening. This gave me approximately 6 hours. I used 4 of them at my desk with the laptop and the USB drive and the letter. The remaining 2 I used carefully. I went to the room where Luke and Sophie kept their things. I will not describe this as a pleasant experience. My son had grown up in this house. I had painted the walls of his childhood bedroom with him when he was 8 years old and had chosen the color together after a lengthy negotiation in which he held out for a shade of orange that I considered too aggressive, and we had settled on a compromise that satisfied neither of us, and that I had been glad about every time I looked at it for the following decade. He had been a good child and then a decent adolescent, and then a young man who had made choices that had progressively moved him away from the things I understood about him. He had married Sophie 9 years ago, and Sophie was intelligent and capable and had a quality of relentless practical ambition that I had always respected even when I found its direction concerning. Together they had built a life that looked well constructed from the outside, and that I was now standing in their room beginning to see more clearly. I was not searching their belongings. I was not going through their personal things, looking for evidence to use against them. I was looking for one specific thing the document Marta had described: the transfer agreement. If it had been filed anywhere, or if a copy existed in the house, I needed to know. I did not find a copy. What I found in a file folder on the desk that Sophie used for her administrative work was a printed email exchange between Sophie and a notary in Bruges, a man named Vermeulen, whose office I knew from the purchase of our house 20 years earlier. The exchange was dated 3 months prior. It was about the preparation of a property transfer document and about certain considerations regarding the timing of its execution. I photographed every page with my phone. I put everything back precisely as I had found it and left the room. I went downstairs and made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and drank it and thought about what I had established and what it meant and what it required of me. What it required was methodology. Exactly what it would require in any professional investigation. No deviation, no acceleration based on emotion, no shortcuts. The evidence Marta had gathered was significant, but not yet sufficient for the action I intended to take. It needed to be corroborated, documented in a form that could be presented to the appropriate authorities and assembled in sequence. This would take time. It would require me to behave for that time as if I knew nothing. I had done this before. I had spent long periods of my professional life inside the evidence of fraud while maintaining normal professional relations with the subjects under investigation. I had sat in meetings with people I knew were lying and asked them questions that allowed them to continue lying while I was gathering the documentation that would eventually make the lying consequential. It was not pleasant work, and it was not pleasant now in the kitchen of my own house, calculating how to be present with my son in the way he expected me to be present while I was building the case that would determine the rest of his life. I called Annalore again that evening. I told her more than I had told her in the morning call. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "How are you, Hendrik?" I said, "I am fine." She was quiet again. She knew me well enough to know that fine meant something specific, and that she should leave it there. She said, "Tomorrow at 8. I said, "Yes." Luke and Sophie came back from Liège at 7:30 that evening. I heard the key in the lock, the specific sounds of them settling back into the house. Sophie came to the kitchen first and asked if I had eaten, and I said I had, and she made herself a cup of tea and stood at the counter with her phone. She was 34 years old, dark-haired, with the face of a person who has organized her expressions carefully and who maintains the organization even in unguarded moments. She asked about the church service, and I told her it had been good. She asked about my afternoon, and I said I had spent it in the study, and she said that sounded peaceful, and I said it had been. She asked as she set her cup down and prepared to leave the kitchen whether Peter had found anything serious with the water stain. I told her it was a window seal and that he would come back to repair it properly. She said, "Good. These old houses, everything is always something." I said, "Yes." She went upstairs. I watched her go, and I noted the question which had been asked in a tone of ordinary domestic concern, and I noted that it was the first question she had asked that touched on Peter's visit, and I noted that she had asked it on her way out of the kitchen rather than as the direct opening of the conversation, which is the manner of a question you want answered, but do not want to appear particularly invested in. I had heard thousands of questions asked in that manner over 38 years. Luke came down in different clothes, having changed from the travel. He was my son's height, and my son's coloring, the dark northern European coloring of my wife's family. And looking at him in the kitchen that evening, I had the specific difficulty that I had been preparing myself for since that morning. The difficulty of looking at someone I loved and had known for 36 years and seeing simultaneously both the person I knew and the structure of what he had been doing. It is the most difficult thing forensic work requires of the human being doing it. The capacity to hold both at once without allowing one to obliterate the other. He poured a beer and asked me how the plumber visit had gone. He knew about Peter's Sunday visit because I had mentioned it the previous week when I had noticed the water stain spreading. I told him it had been a window seal issue minor already addressed. He nodded and said that was a relief and went to sit in the living room with his beer. He had not asked about the paneling. He had not looked at the door to Marta's room as he passed it in the hall. I noted both of these things. The following 6 weeks were the most demanding of my professional life, and I include in that assessment several investigations that had involved hostile subjects, legal complications, and physical risk. They were demanding not because the work itself was technically complex, though it was complex, but because the work had to be done in parallel with the daily life of the house, which continued without pause or accommodation because no one else in the house knew the work was happening. I want to describe those 6 weeks specifically because the description matters for understanding what the work required. The mornings began the same way they had always begun. I woke at 6:30, made coffee, read the newspaper. Luke and Sophie came down at various times, and I spoke to them in the register of ordinary domestic exchange about the weather and the news and what needed to be purchased at the market. Sophie had a quality of pleasantness that had always required me to pay close attention to distinguish from actual warmth. In those 6 weeks I paid closer attention, and the distinction became very clear. She asked after my health with a specificity that I now understood as monitoring. She mentioned the house occasionally obliquely in ways that were not quite suggestions and not quite questions. I responded to each of these in the manner of a man who had noticed nothing. The afternoons I spent in my study, or at Annalore's office, building the file. Felix Mortier worked with a speed that reminded me of his professional prime when he had been the best asset tracer in the joint unit, and had found money in places that required a specific quality of relentlessness to find. He traced the private account from the partial account number in Marta's photographs through 3 institutional layers, and a nominee structure that had been designed to make beneficial ownership difficult to determine quickly, but that was not by the standards of what Felix had dismantled in his career, particularly sophisticated. He said to me at one point, "Hendrik, whoever set this up had watched too many films. The real sophisticated structures look boring. This one looks like it is trying to look sophisticated, and those are always the easiest to trace. He found connections I had not expected. The credit facility secured against the anticipated inheritance was not the full picture. There were two additional elements: a personal guarantee given by Luke to a private investor in a commercial property project in Antwerp that had not performed, and a tax matter involving declared income from Sophie's consulting work that had discrepancies Felix identified in approximately 40 minutes of looking at the available public records. The investor and the tax matter were separate from the primary inheritance question, but they were relevant to the financial pressure that had apparently motivated the urgency of the request to Marta. Chris worked with the audio files for 4 days. He produced clean transcripts of all 11 recordings with timestamps and speaker identification in a format that would be usable in legal proceedings. He also found something in the metadata of the phone photographed documents that Marta had captured. The photographs had been taken in 2 separate sessions 6 weeks apart, which established that Marta had had access to the documents on 2 occasions and that the documents had changed between those occasions, corroborating her description in the letter of having been shown 2 different versions of the transfer agreement. I gave Chris and Felix the USB drive after making 3 copies of its contents, which I stored in 3 separate locations. Annalore had one. My safe deposit box at the Belfius branch in Bruges had one, and I kept one on a drive in my study that I had secured in the way I secured important professional material, which is to say thoroughly. Annalore and I met 3 times a week, always outside the house, always in her office or in a small cafe near the Justice of the Peace office that we had used for years. She reviewed what I had gathered and told me what else was needed and connected me with 2 specialists, a digital forensics expert named Chris, who worked with her firm on financial fraud matters, and a former colleague of mine from the Joint Investigative Unit, now retired, named Felix Mortier, who had spent his career in asset tracing and who knew the structures of Belgian private banking with the particular intimacy of someone who had spent decades finding money people thought was hidden. What Felix found working from the partial account number visible in Marta's photographs and from the email exchange with the notary was the full picture of the bank account. It was a joint account held in the names of Luc Klaas and Sophie van den Berge at a private bank in Antwerp. The account had been opened 2 years earlier. The transactions visible in Marta's photographs were part of a larger pattern that Felix traced over 14 months involving transfers from what appeared to be several sources that required further investigation. What Chris found analyzing the recording files from the USB drive with professional equipment was cleaner and higher quality audio than could be heard on my laptop speakers. He was able to confirm the identity of both voices in each recording and to enhance sections that had been unclear on initial listening. He was also able to extract metadata from the phone photographed documents that established the date on which each photograph had been taken, which corroborated the timeline Marta had described in her letter. What Annalore found reviewing the land registry and the notary's records was that a property transfer document had been prepared by Vermeulen's office for the Bruges house, but had not been filed. The reason it had not been filed was that the required signature had not been obtained. Marta had not signed. The document existed in a preliminary state at the notary's office, prepared and ready, but unsigned, a monument to the fact that my wife had refused 3 times under pressure to do what they were asking. The full picture that assembled over those 6 weeks was this: Luke and Sophie had become convinced at some point in the 2 years before Marta's death that the estate they expected to inherit was not going to be managed in the way they had planned. I do not know exactly when this conviction formed or what triggered it. What I know from the financial records Felix traced is that they had borrowed against anticipated inheritance in a way that created a debt structure that required the estate to be realized quickly and completely. The property in Bruges was the primary asset. The transfers in the private account were connected to a series of investments that had not performed, and that had been financed through a credit facility secured against what the bank had apparently been told was a guaranteed inheritance. The bank had apparently not done its due diligence with the rigor that rigor required. When Marta had declined to sign the transfer document, the financial structure they had built around the anticipated inheritance began to experience pressure. The pressure increased over the following months. This explained, in the cold terminology of financial analysis, the escalation of the requests and the nature of the final recordings, in which the tone had moved beyond persuasion into something that required other words. I presented the assembled documentation to Annalore in a comprehensive file at the beginning of the 7th week. She reviewed it over 2 days and came back to me with a legal assessment that was measured and specific, and that I had expected in its general shape, if not in every detail. She said the recordings and documents established a credible case for attempted financial coercion of a vulnerable adult, specifically in the context of Belgian elder financial abuse statutes that had been significantly strengthened in recent legislation. She said the bank account records and the debt structure, once fully traced by Felix, would likely establish a pattern of financial misrepresentation to a credit institution. She said she wanted to bring in a prosecutor she knew in the Bruges district, who specialized in elder financial abuse cases and who she believed would take this seriously. I asked her to give me 1 week before she made that call. She asked why. I told her there was something I needed to do first. I needed to speak to Luke. I have thought about this decision many times since, and I have not changed my view that it was the correct one. Not because I believed the conversation would change the outcome. I knew it would not change the outcome. I had assembled the documentation, and it was what it was, and the legal process was going to proceed from it with or without a conversation. But Marta had spent the last months of her life gathering evidence in secret because she did not have the physical capacity to manage a confrontation. She had done the work she could do, and she had left the rest to me. What she had not been able to do because she was dying was look her son in the face and tell him what she knew. I could do that. I could do it for both of us. I asked Luke to come to my study on a Thursday evening after Sophie had gone to a meeting she had weekly at a co-working space in the city center. I told him I wanted to talk about the house and the estate, that I had been doing some review of things and wanted his thoughts. He came in the easy manner of someone who has no reason to expect anything unusual and sat in the chair across from my desk. I put Marta's letter on the desk between us. He looked at it. He recognized the handwriting. He was quiet. I told him what I knew. Not everything, not the full technical detail of the financial structure, but the substance, the box, the letter, the recordings, the documents, the 2 versions of the transfer agreement, the private bank account, Felix's work. I told him in the flat measured register I used for professional communications because it was the register I had available and because I thought it was the most honest way to deliver information of this weight. I did not shout. I did not cry, though there was a point at approximately 6 minutes in during which I had to pause for several seconds to ensure I would not. I told him what his mother had done in the months before she died, what it had required of her, what it had cost her. He did not speak for a long time after I finished. Then he said I didn't know it would hurt her. I looked at him. I said, "What did you think it would do?" He didn't answer. I said, "Luke, I need you to understand something. The legal process is already prepared. Annalore has everything. What happens next is not something I can stop, and I am not going to try to stop it. What I am giving you now is the opportunity to know what is coming before it comes, and to decide whether you want to manage what happens next, with some dignity or without it," he said. What does that mean? I said. It means you have the choice of cooperating fully with the legal process, and with the financial institutions, and with whatever the prosecutor requires of you, in which case the process will be what it is, but it will be shorter and more navigable. Or you can decide to contest it, in which case the process will be longer, and the documentation is thorough enough that the outcome will be the same and the cost of reaching it will be higher for everyone. He looked at the letter on the desk. He said, "Is Sophie going to be charged?" I said, "That is not a decision I have made. It is a decision the prosecutor will make." He said, "She was the one who..." He stopped. He looked at the window. He said, "She was the one who had the idea." I said, "I know." He said, "I let her." I said, "I know that too." He was quiet again for a long time. The Thursday evening outside was doing what November evenings in Bruges do, settling into the cold and the lamplight and the canal water, the city arranging itself into the specific stillness of a place that has been here for 8 centuries and will be here for 8 more, and is not unduly concerned about any particular Thursday. He said Mama knew. She knew the whole time. I said, yes, she knew. He said, she didn't say anything to me. I said, she didn't have the strength for the conversation. She had the strength for the documentation. He was silent for a long time. I let the silence be. I had learned in 38 years of professional interviews that the silence after the significant statement is where the most important things arrive if you let them arrive, rather than filling the space yourself. He put his hands flat on the desk in front of him and looked at them. He said, when did she hide the box? I said, she started the recordings about 8 months before she died. Based on the timestamps, she put the box in the cavity wall approximately 3 months later. She was still mobile enough then, just. It would have required some physical effort. He closed his eyes. I said, she unscrewed the baseboard herself, with a flathead screwdriver. There were fresh screwdriver marks in the paint when Peter found the section. She did it alone. He made a sound that I will not attempt to describe. I said, Luke, I am not telling you this to hurt you further. I am telling you so that you understand the full picture of what your mother chose to do with the time she had. She had many things she could have done with that time. She chose to build this. She chose it because she trusted that it would matter when the time came. She trusted me, and she trusted the process, and she was right about both. He was quiet for a long time after that. When he spoke again, his voice had the quality of someone who has been stripped of the layer that was not real and is now speaking from whatever is underneath. He said the investor. The Antwerp project. It was Sophie's contact. I introduced them, but it was her idea and her structure. He paused. She said it was a sure thing. She had projections. He said, I wanted to believe the projections. I said, I know. He said the request to Mama. I thought if we could secure the house, the bank would restructure the credit. I thought we could fix everything before anyone needed to know. He looked at the letter on the desk. I thought she would agree eventually. I thought she would understand it was for the family. He said the last sentence in the voice of a man who has heard his own rationalization and understood for perhaps the first time what it is. I said, your mother understood exactly what it was. He said, did she hate me? I said what I had said before, in the only form that was available to me. She hid a box in the wall of her room so that you could be found out after she was gone. A woman who had stopped loving you would have let it go. She did not let it go. He was quiet for a long moment. Then why? Why would she go through all of that if she was going to let the legal process run anyway? If she knew you would handle it, why not just tell you? Why the box? I thought about this. I said, because she was not certain she would have the time or the strength to tell me directly before the end. Because she needed it to be evidence, not accusation, and evidence has to be gathered before the moment it is needed. She was a precise woman. She made contingency plans. She trusted the plan over the contingency of her own continued capacity to execute it. He looked at his hands again. He said she was always smarter than I gave her credit for. I said yes, she was. He said you need to call a lawyer tonight. A good one independent of Sophie. Call before morning. He said yes. He left the study. I heard him on the phone in his room for the rest of the evening. The following morning, Sophie left the house early before either of us came downstairs. She did not return that day or the next. She had understood from Luke's behavior that something had shifted, and she was the kind of person who reads shifts quickly and responds with movement. 2 weeks later, the legal process began formally. The prosecutor, Anna Lore, had contacted, reviewed the file, and moved with the efficiency that well-prepared files tend to produce. Luke cooperated fully from the beginning, which did not remove consequence but shaped its form. The bank presented with Felix's documentation of the financial misrepresentation in the credit application, began its own procedures. The notary Vermeulen was interviewed regarding the preparation of the unsigned transfer document. The private account was examined. I stayed in the house throughout. There was no reason to leave, and I did not want to leave. It was my house and Marta's house, and I was going to stay in it and continue to live in it as I had lived in it for more than 30 years. 3 months after the Thursday evening conversation, I was standing in Marta's room. The water seal on the window had been properly repaired by Peter, who had come back twice at my invitation, and who now knew some of what had happened, and who sat with me in the kitchen one afternoon in January, over coffee and said nothing in the particular way that said everything. The paneling had been replaced. I had done this myself on a Saturday morning, driving to the timber merchant and selecting a section of pine that matched the original well enough, sanding and painting it in the style of the surrounding panels, fitting it into the wall with the tools I knew well enough for simple carpentry. The box was on the mantelpiece. I had cleaned it. I had read the notebook which contained Marta's observations from the final months, her notes on what she had seen and heard, and what she had concluded written in her handwriting in the slight disorder of hands that were no longer reliable. I had read every page. I had read it the way she had written it, carefully and completely. And I had understood reading it the specific quality of courage it required to do what she had done in the time she had left. To spend the last months of a dying life not on the things you love, but on the documentation of the thing that threatened what you loved. I sat in her armchair by the window. The Delft tiles on the fireplace surround reflected the light. 8 tiles each with a different Dutch landscape, windmills and waterways and flat horizons, the landscape she had grown up in and had never entirely left. She had found them at the Amsterdam market. On a Saturday we had spent there 20 years earlier, carrying them wrapped in newspaper on the train back to Bruges, arranging them on the mantelpiece in the hotel room that evening to see how they would look together, as pleased with the arrangement as a child with a new thing. I looked at the tiles for a long time. Then I said to the room, to the chair, to the Delft tiles and the November light, I found it. I told you I would find it. The legal process concluded 8 months after the Thursday conversation. The specific terms I will not detail here, because some of them involve people other than my son, and those people retain a right to their privacy in the parts of the story that are theirs. What I will tell you is that the outcome was proportionate, which is the word I use for results that correspond accurately to the facts and their severity. The bank resolved its matter. The credit facility was restructured and eventually closed. The property in Bruges remained mine, as it had always been mine, as Marta had fought to ensure it remained. The process did what processes do when they are given good documentation and allowed to run their course. Luc served a suspended sentence and a substantial financial penalty. He moved out of Bruges after the legal process concluded. He lives in Ghent now, I am told, in a shared apartment, doing work I understand to be honest and modest. He calls me on the first Sunday of every month. The calls are not long and they are not easy, but they are real, which is more than I had expected, and which is something I am not going to examine too closely for fear of disturbing what makes them possible. His voice on the phone has a quality it did not have before, a kind of plainness, the particular quality of a person who has stopped performing. Sophie, I have not spoken to and do not expect to speak to. She had managed through the legal process to demonstrate that several of the central decisions had been made independently of her influence, a demonstration that I had no evidence to refute to the satisfaction of the legal threshold required. She left Belgium in the spring. I do not know where she went, and I find I genuinely do not need to know. Peter came back in February and fixed a proper structural problem with the kitchen drain that had been developing for several years. We had coffee after. He looked at the room with Marta's things in it, and he said, "Are you going to leave it like this?" I said, "For now." He nodded. He is that kind of man. I want to say something about Peter, because he deserves to be said accurately. He is 51 years old, and he has been fixing things in Belgian houses since he was 17, and he has, through this career, developed a quality that the best tradespeople develop, and that has no official name, but that I think of as structural honesty. He sees what is wrong with things, and he says what it is and what it will cost to fix. And he does not say it will be simple when it will not be simple, and he does not find problems that do not exist. He is in the vocabulary I have for professional qualities, trustworthy in the deepest sense of the word. Which is to say, you can rely on his assessment of a situation to correspond to the actual situation. He had called me on a Sunday morning from my wife's room and told me to come home alone, and he had waited and shown me what he had found, and he had asked nothing about it beyond what was necessary to understand what had happened and whether I needed him to stay. When I told him to go out through the back garden and wait around the corner, he did not ask why. He went. He is the kind of person around whom it is possible to do difficult things, because he does not make the difficult things harder by requiring management. I told him in February the outline of what had happened. Not everything. The outline was enough. He listened without interruption. Then he said, "Marta." I said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I always thought she was a very precise person." I said, "Yes, she was." He picked up his coffee cup and looked out at the garden and said, "Good." He meant it as a complete sentence, and it was one. Anna-Laura and I have lunch on the first Tuesday of every month at a restaurant on the market square that we have been going to for years. We talk about work and about the cases she is handling, and occasionally about the case that brought us back into regular contact. With the professional detachment of people who have processed something through their expertise and need occasionally to confirm that the processing was sound. She told me at our lunch in October that the prosecutor had used the documentation from the case in a training program for junior investigators handling elder financial abuse. She said they had found Marta's recordings particularly useful as an example of what a non-professional witness can document without legal training and what that documentation can achieve. I found this the most satisfying thing I had heard about the whole matter. Felix Mortier retired fully in March and moved to a house outside Ghent, where he grows vegetables with an enthusiasm I find both bewildering and comforting. He sends me photographs of his garden occasionally. The beetroots are apparently exceptional. I do not know what to do with this information, but I appreciate it. I am sitting in Marta's chair as I write this. The January light through the window is the flat northern European light of deep winter, no warmth and no shadow, just the clear cold illumination of a January morning in Bruges. The canal outside is gray and still. The Delft tiles are on the fireplace. The green metal box is on the mantelpiece. I have decided to leave it there. People ask me sometimes how I processed what happened. They mean I think how I processed the discovery about Luke. They are asking about grief and betrayal, and the specific category of pain that belongs to the recognition that a child you raised has made choices that put them in fundamental opposition to everything you tried to teach them. I tell them what is true, which is that I processed it the way I process everything, through methodology, through the careful assembly of facts, through the application of the analytical capacity that has been the central tool of my working life. This is not a satisfying answer to most people. They would prefer a more dramatic account of suffering and eventual healing. But the honest account is that the methodology was not a defense against the grief. It was the form the grief took. Every fact I assembled was also a fact about my son. Every recording Chris cleaned up was also my wife's voice in the last months of her life, documenting the behavior of the boy she had raised and loved for 36 years. The methodology did not separate me from that. It put me directly in contact with it repeatedly in the most detailed form available. I processed it, and I mean this accurately, by working. That is what I have always done with things that are too large for ordinary emotional management. I work carefully and completely, and I follow the evidence wherever it leads, and I do not stop following it until the picture is complete. When the picture is complete, I know what to do. When I know what to do, I do it. When I have done it, I sit in the chair by the window, as I am sitting now, and I look at the canal, and I hold the weight of what has happened, and I let it be what it is. What it is now, 14 months after the Sunday morning in November, is this a weight that is smaller than it was, and that has a different quality from what it had at the beginning. It is no longer the weight of something active and threatening. It is the weight of something concluded, the specific gravity of a chapter, whose last page has been read and that has been placed on the shelf. The house has a quality now that I did not expect. I expected the quiet of a house in which a bad thing had happened and been resolved. What I have instead is the quiet of a house in which a good thing is also true, which is that my wife, in the last months of her life, sat in the chair I am sitting in and made a plan and executed it with the resources available to her, and trusted me with what she had built. The quiet of the house includes that. It includes the specific warmth of being trusted by someone who knew you completely and chose to trust you anyway. I walked into the garden this morning before sitting down to write. The January garden is bare and gray, and the canal wall has a specific moss at the waterline that appears this time of year in a precise shade of green that Marta always described as the green of genuine winter, Not decorative winter, but the real thing. She would walk the garden in all weathers. In the years when she could still walk it easily, and she had an exact vocabulary for the seasonal states of every plant and wall and water surface. I have not developed this vocabulary. I walk the garden, and I see it, and I value what I see, but I do not have her words for it. I looked at the canal wall this morning, and I thought about the green of genuine winter, which is the green of things that survive by being low to the ground and persistent and not requiring much. I thought about my wife describing it. I thought about 38 years of marriage, which is long enough to have a vocabulary for moss, and short enough that the absence of the person who taught you the vocabulary is still a daily discovery. Then I came in and made coffee and sat in her chair and began to write this. The monthly calls from Luke continue. They are what they are. They are real, which is more than I had reason to hope for in November of last year, and which I am not going to examine too closely for fear of disturbing what makes them possible. I said to Annalore at our October lunch that I had been surprised by the calls. She said, "Are you?" I thought about it. I said, "No, I don't think I am." She said, "No. Your wife didn't let go of him either. She let go of pretending not to see what he was doing." Those are different things. I said, "Yes, they are." In December, he said on one of the calls that he had been thinking about Marta. He said he had been thinking about the box specifically. He said she must have been very frightened when she was making all those recordings, when she was hiding the box. I said, "I don't think so." I thought about it as I said it. I said, "I think she was clear." I think by the time she was doing those things, she had already moved through the frightened part and arrived at the part where you know what has to be done and you do it. He was quiet. He said, "That sounds like her?" I said, "Yes, it does." He said, "Did she ever say anything to you before about any of it?" I said, "No." He said, "Not even a hint." I said, "If she had given me a hint, I would have acted on it immediately and the situation would have resolved differently." She knew that. She decided that the evidence had to be complete before it could be used. She decided correctly. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She was protecting you too, wasn't she? Not just herself, not just the house." I said, "Yes. I think she was protecting me from acting on incomplete information in a way that would have cost more than waiting." He said she always thought several steps ahead. I said, "Yes, she always did." I am 69 years old, and I was trained to find things that were hidden. I found what Marta hid. I found it the way she trusted I would find it, by paying attention, by applying methodology to the evidence, by following the trail from the first anomaly to the final account. I did what she could not do, and she did what I would not have thought to do, and together, across the distance of 14 months, and the larger distance of whatever comes after October, and the armchair by the window, we did what needed to be done. The house is mine. It has always been mine. It has the specific quality now of a house that has been tested and has held the quality of a structure that has been loaded beyond its designed capacity and has survived not unchanged but sound. The walls are original. The paneling is repaired. The tiles are Marta's. I sat in her chair this morning, and I held a cup of tea in my hands, and I looked at the January canal, and I thought about the combination lock on the green metal box, the 4 numbers I had known for 40 years, the year we were married, the year that was the beginning of everything that mattered, 1978. Spinning to the right combination in the room she had built for herself in the last months of her life, clicking open. She knew I would find it. She had known me for 41 years. And she knew exactly the kind of person who finds things, and she built something that was waiting to be found, and she sealed it and trusted it and left it in the wall of her room like a letter addressed to the right reader. I always find things that are hidden. That is the whole of it. That is everything.